I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor, and I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Welcome back to the Editing Podcast. So we're delighted to welcome back a special guest who wowed us with her expertise and fabulousness last time she came on here.
That's right. It's the marvellous Crystal Shelley, who helped us open our minds and improve our editorial practice when she last came onto the podcast to talk about authenticity reading.
Yeah, so welcome, Crystal.
Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
You're so welcome.
It's so lovely to see you again. So we were thrilled when Crystal agreed to come back and help us and our listeners understand more about microaggressions. Now, one way of looking at this is spotting microaggressions that our clients have introduced into their writing.
That's right. But the angle Crystal's going to approach this from today is another side of the fence, that of the editor, and how all of us can work to avoid bringing our own identity-based biases into our editorial practice.
So, Crystal, why don't we start at the beginning? And perhaps you can explain to us what exactly are microaggressions, not specifically in editing, but generally.
Yeah, that's a great question because it's important to understand that before we even go into editing. Microaggressions are brief, commonplace comments or actions that signal biased or negative attitudes toward marginalized groups. They're often unconscious or unintentional. So, as opposed to more overt displays of hate or bigotry, microaggressions can often be dismissed as ignorance or jokes, but they're still harmful.
Like
so,
banter.
some example. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
Sorry,
Louise.
like banter. Like,
right.
People are just, and there's been a massive case of that in Britain recently with in terms of our cricket teams, hasn't there, Denise?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, people, as you say, Crystal, people dismissing things as, oh, it's just a joke, it's just banter, but actually, like you say, it has an impact on other people.
Yeah, for sure. So, some examples of what microaggressions can look like include telling people of color that they speak English well when English is their first language. Or sometimes articles might refer to a woman by her first name, whereas men are referred by their last name. Or when a gay person is jokingly told that their sexuality is just a phase and they'll get over it. So they might seem like minor things if you just hear about them, but they come from a place of bias and they can do a lot of harm to the people who are experiencing them.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That point you raised there about women being called by their first name and men by their last name, I see that getting picked up a lot more recently during this pandemic when they've been interviewing people, and there's been examples of women who are, perhaps professors in microbiology, and their titles aren't being put on the screen, but a man with the same title has professor, or the woman, like you say, is addressed by their first name, but the man is called professor or doctor, even though she may have those titles as well. And it's really insidious, isn't it? It's all around us without us really realizing it. So what would you say that these look like in more specifically in editing then, Crystal?
Yeah, so writers often make conscious choices in their writing to affirm their identities or to follow up-to-date language guidance or to use anti-oppressive language. So microaggressions in editing occur when editors make changes to that text that undo or undermine a writer's conscious choices without having discussions with the writer first.
Yeah. So I think it would be really helpful, Crystal, if we can maybe work through some examples. So can you give us one?
Yes. So an important style recommendation that's happened in the last 2 years is the capitalization of Black. Black is recommended to be capitalized when referring to race or identity, but an editor might see it in writing and lowercase it because that's what they're used to seeing, or maybe they don't understand the importance of capitalization and they think it looks weird like that. but that capitalization is a conscious choice that's been fought for, and lowercasing it is undoing that.
Yeah, that's a really, really great example, and something that comes up in my work quite a lot as well.
And I think that's one of those things as well, where if you make the effort to be involved in diverse editorial communities, you're much more likely to be exposed to the conversations around these sorts of things and these choices. And that's another important point for editors to seek out these forums and these areas where they can hear from other editors from different races and ethnicities and different backgrounds to learn more from them.
And it also helps you move away from that even a lot of editors sometimes even don't realize they're being pedantic or peevy with their with the consistency. So sometimes, I've seen editors say in the past, well, I don't capitalize white, therefore it's inconsistent. And it's like we need to be able to have a develop this mindset that enables us to drill a bit deeper with our consistency and say, well, I'll always be consistent when I'm using Black and referring to ethnicity or our identity, but I'm always going to lowercase white. And so it is really important, as Denise said, just to have these conversations and be exposed to it.
Yeah, I
to
think
be
that's the thing,
exposed to those
to listen.
conversations. Yeah,
It's to listen, isn't it?
Another example would be hyphenating compound nationalities like Asian American or French Canadian. It's common to see these hyphenated, but both Chicago and AP recommend not hyphenating them. And removing the hyphen can also be a powerful statement of identity and belonging. Henry Furman, who's a friend and a retired copy desk chief of the LA Times, he wrote an article for Conscious Style Guide called Drop the Hyphen in Asian American, where he explores what the hyphen can signal. So an editor might insert the hyphen without understanding its significance, even when the writer has consciously chosen not to hyphenate. So with that, and with the capitalization of Black, the editor is committing a microaggression that's harmful, likely without realizing it, but they're undermining what the writer is doing.
Yeah, God, the weight of a hyphen, the load that brings with it. Is
right. We don't think about what something like capitalization or hyphenation can do. To us, it's just part of the style, but there can be so much more behind it.
Absolutely, yeah. And another area that perhaps you can talk to us about, Crystal, is I've heard and taken part in conversations about whether non-English words should be italicized in English text. So maybe you can tell us something about that as well.
Yeah, this is a big conversation that's been happening lately. A lot of us are used to seeing non-English words italicized in text, no matter the context. And it's usually done as a signal to readers to say that a word is in another language and it's something to pay attention to, which can be good for teaching purposes, but there are some drawbacks that can come with it. So for one, English has a lot of borrowed words and phrases that aren't italicized because they're so common. You wouldn't see cappuccino or kindergarten italicized. But people who are multilingual might switch between different languages. So italicizing non-English words can signal otherness and take away from the way speakers switch naturally between one language and English. Personally, too, I feel that italics can be distracting. Many editors and publishers have chosen not to italicize non-English words unless they're used for emphasis or for words as words. And this is an ongoing conversation, but I do see trends shifting to favor keeping non-English words in Roman.
You've raised such a good point there. What is a non-English word? When you think about how English itself, it has changed since, say, the 14th century, when it was unrecognizable to in some ways to what it is now. It seems odd, doesn't it? You could, if you really wanted to go deep with this, you could probably italicize an entire text and go, that's actually not what English looked like, whenever. And I agree with you about that. that distracting thing, especially when you're working with fiction, and you might, like you said, you're using italic for thoughts or words as words, but also for thoughts. And if you've got, and look, when a reader reads a word that they identify as not English, they can usually do that with the letters. Do you know what I mean? You don't need the italic as well. So
it can be like, you know, sort of hammering the point home there, really, and it lifts the reader out of that.
Yeah.
You know, lifts them out of the story, really, doesn't it? When it's,
yeah,
you know,
that's a really good point.
Pointing at something, you know, so it's like shouting a little bit at them.
And drawing attention to the italic rather than the words themselves, and just the continuous narrative or dialogue that's in those words on the page. So I just mentioned fiction there, but maybe we could talk a little bit more about that, because when editors butcher authentic narrative and spoken voices that use so-called non-standard grammatical structures, that's a problem, isn't it? Maybe we could explore that a little bit, Crystal.
Yeah, so Louise, I'm sure we both run into this all the time as fiction editors. You know, sometimes editors get so caught up in trying to make English proper or adhere to a set of rules they believe exist that they impose these on the writing, no matter the context. I mean, you mentioned like pedantry earlier, right? So fiction writers may choose to write their narrative or dialogue in ways that reflect certain dialects, regionalisms, colloquialisms, you know, you name it. And if an editor changes ain't to isn't, or I'm doing good to I'm doing well in order to, you know, sound more proper, then they're signaling that these phrases we hear every day in speech are wrong or have no place in stories.
That's so interesting. Yeah, because you know, I see that a lot with Scots and Scottish, where, you know, people are very good at code switching, because, you know, Scots is often seen as a slang or common, and actually people that write authentically in Scots, they're using their language to express, you know, how they speak in the real world. If you think of people like, you know, Irving Welsh or whoever, and you know, there's a lot of people look down on that, like, you know, it's not proper. You can't see, but I'm doing air quotes here. You know, but what is proper English? That's
right.
Proper English that
that's a whole conversation.
Yeah,
it is a huge conversation, isn't it?
Who sets those standards? Who set those standards that decided it was a standard? Probably not the kind of people who are like most of us.
Yeah.
In fact, I had a thing with that in a project I'm working on at the moment. Not to do with race or identity, but it's a story that features a former Marine, and I noticed that the author had capitalized Marine all the way through, and my first instinct was to lowercase it, because soldier was lowercased and police was lowercased, and then I was thinking about the recording we were going to be doing tonight, and I thought, hang on a minute, just hang on a minute before you get too clever there. And I went, and it took me 3 minutes to find the answer on the internet, and that was the interesting thing. And some major US newspapers have actually changed their style guides to allow to make that word capitalized in all instances. Again, it's about just respecting the wishes of those service people, and so it's not about whether I agree with it or whether I actually think that the capital letter looks odd. It's a piece of fiction, and the author has obviously made a conscious decision, and I would be doing exactly what you suggested right at the top of this recording, Crystal. I would be undoing something that was a conscious decision made by him that reflects a particular position that he takes. And so, you know, even in fiction, when it's you know, we're not dealing with an obvious academic political discourse. Even in fiction, it's really, really important to just step back and think before you start trying to impose so-called consistency. What are you know, is this going to harm somebody? So that was an interesting lesson that nearly even tripped me up just you know, a few days ago.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It is, yeah. And this, I think we can get really tied up in consistency sometimes as editors and style sheets and style guides, and forget about the end point here and what is the purpose of this writing and who is this writing for. And you know, it's very true, you have to know the rules to break the rules, but sometimes the rules are fluid and they're not necessarily they're not necessarily what you were used to even 2 years ago. You know, things change that frequently. And it does feel that we're in a time of quite a lot of flux at the moment. And I think as editors we really need to take the time to let it go, but also to keep up to date. Louise, I can't stand any more of your singing. Stop it. Anyway, let's move on. And I don't even know if I dare mention this, but there is also the singular they. And it must, sometimes I think we feel as editors, have we not done this to death? But it's such an important point, isn't it? And it's one that many people still struggle with. And we've talked about it on the podcast before, haven't we, Crystal?
Yeah, I remember I listen to y'all when I go for my step walks, and I'm like, oh yes, the singular they. When y'all were talking about it. Yeah, I wonder when we'll be able to stop talking about it too.
Yeah.
But you know, there are editors who hate the singular they because they you know, they're they think it's grammatically incorrect or just not right. But it is the most gender inclusive singular pronoun that we have in English, at least for the time being, unless another one comes along. So if a writer has used the singular they to be more inclusive and an editor changes it to he or she, and that's doing harm. It doesn't matter whether an editor thinks it's right or wrong. It matters what a writer wants to do with their writing.
Exactly.
So I'm all in favor of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I work a lot on student textbooks, and I routinely change he or she to they now. What I do is I don't even go back and ask the desk editor. I make the change and then I tell them in my handover note that I've done it, because I just think we shouldn't be perpetuating that in textbooks that are teaching kids or adults English as another language. They need to know that they is an acceptable singular.
Certainly within a lot of British schools now, regardless of what's happening actually in the classroom for the teaching, in terms of the more what's that word? I've forgotten.
What's the word?
Anyway, it's you know, the pastoral side of school and college.
Right.
Certainly in my experience with my own child, I've noticed that the teachers are right on it in terms of talking about gender inclusivity, talking about non-binary people, that he or she aren't the only pronouns out there, and introducing them to some of the neo-pronouns that are gender neutral, and they is one of them, and so it's even a case that the way that we edit needs to keep in step with some of the decisions that have been making in our education system, and it's really important, like especially like the work you do, Denise. I don't work on any of that type of thing, but that work you do on educational materials, it's really important that mirrors what's going on.
Absolutely, it's important that students see themselves reflected in the materials that they're using to learn.
Rather than it being a different thing, it's usual and expected to see that stuff. It's not, therefore it's not othering. So Crystal, can we talk a little bit about why these microaggressions?
It's a hard word.
I know. In fact, Denise is the only one not to stumble over it so far.
It must be my Scottish accent.
Don't jinx it.
Yeah. I'm sure we can have a little tremble, Denise, before the end of the podcast. Let's work on that.
I'll work on it. Yeah.
So why do microaggressions occur in editing, Crystal?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, these are usually unintentional. An editor likely isn't meaning to do harm. And they might happen because an editor is unfamiliar with the material, so they don't know what the latest guidance is, or they might be following an outdated style guide or dictionary entry, or they might just think something's wrong because it goes against what they're used to. So when an editor assumes they know what's right without researching or querying the writer, then they might intervene incorrectly.
Yeah, that's a great
That's
point.
that's a really good point. Yeah. So, Crystal, can you tell us a little bit about what the impact of microaggressions can be on the writer? I mean, how do these affect them?
Microaggressions in editing can lead to significant distrust on the writer's part, and because it may be doing harm to them and to their writing. And this is especially true for a writer who is affirming their identities or choosing anti-oppressive language and style. And they can be yet another reminder for a writer that they have to keep fighting for validation or inclusion in publishing. One example that I think a lot of editors may have heard about was in December of 2020. There was an article published. Christian Minter wrote an article about an experience with an editor who made damaging changes to copy that resulted in them deciding to pull their article. And it was about language regarding race, Black people in particular. So Christian Minter wrote this article and said, quote, "Small tweaks that seem harmless can create a totally different narrative. Editorial choices can either elevate our message or filter and silence it," end quote. So I think that's very powerful in showing what these microaggressions in editing can do. Again, even if the editor isn't trying to do any of this harm.
That quote just sums it up totally, doesn't it? That just encapsulates everything of the unintentional damage that an editor can do through lack of awareness.
And a really good reminder that it's, if in doubt, query rather than just, getting your digital red pen out.
Yeah.
Maybe some listeners are thinking, this doesn't apply to me because the projects I work on are this or that. So why is it important for all editors to know about this?
Many editors will probably say that one of the most important rules of editing is do no harm. I mean, we try not to think about rules, right? But I think that's one that many of us follow.
Yeah.
And we often think about that in terms of introducing errors, but it's important to know that we can do harm to the writer and the writing through microaggressions. And for me, understanding this reminds me to be humble in what I think I know and to be curious about everything. It really doesn't matter what type of editing we're doing, what genre we specialize in, or what clients we work with. Microaggressions can occur in anything we do.
Yeah.
Like you say, Crystal, it's really humbling just to keep that in mind, isn't it? Just to be aware of the power of our decisions. They can do good, but they can do harm as well. Yeah.
And also when we do that harm, we don't just harm our writers, we harm our own industry's reputation and the trust in us. And that's a different problem, but a problem worth acknowledging.
Definitely. Yeah. Crystal, could you perhaps give us and our listeners some advice on what work editors can do to avoid doing harm when it comes to their editing practice?
I say this a lot, but there's a reason why I do. Query as a learner rather than assume as an expert. So editors are experts on a lot of things, right? Especially when it comes to language, but we're not experts on a writer's identities or always with what they're trying to achieve with their writing. So we can ask questions of both the writer and ourselves rather than just go in and make changes without having the knowledge we need to do so. Also, understand when we're not the best person for the job. Just like we might turn down a job in a different specialty or genre because we're not the best fit, we can evaluate if the writing is about a topic that's very involved or requires knowledge of sensitive subjects. And sometimes a project might be better served by an editor who has specialist knowledge.
Yeah,
Definitely,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, don't be afraid to say no. I love that query as a learner rather than assume as an expert. Just saying that again so that people can hear it twice.
We should all have that on post-it notes on our screens, you know.
And t-shirts.
Crystal,
well.
You need to get t-shirts, definitely, or stickers or something.
I will get on that.
Yeah, merch. So one of the things we often hear editors say is about how do we learn about what we don't know? And many of us are conscious of not expecting those who have lived experience of microaggressions to do all the work. You got any advice for us on that?
Yeah, this is a tough one, and it's an ongoing one too, just because, how do we know what we don't know? So we can learn about our own unconscious biases and knowledge gaps, and this can involve understanding our own identities and our relationships with privilege and oppression. And again, that's a huge topic that can span many episodes. I won't go into all the details, but that is key in all of this. But aside from that, when a writer is writing about identities or experiences I don't have, my job is to listen, research, and ask questions, not to impose my will. And it's important for editors too to stay up to date on current language guidance beyond popular style guides and dictionaries. As good as they are in providing direction, they are not, the end all be all on, every up-to-date style choice, especially when it comes to social justice movements. There are also some great resources and other points too. So I recommend signing up for Conscious Style Guide's monthly newsletter. Conscious Style Guide is a website that talks about conscious language, and it's very relevant to this conversation. I think a lot of editors probably know about it already, but if you don't, please check it out. But if you sign up for the Conscious Style Guide newsletter, then you get an email in your inbox. You don't get an inbox. You get an email in your inbox once a month with articles about latest language guidance. So that's a really easy thing to do. You can also, if you're on social media, follow activists who talk about language issues. That's a great way. And that's something that I do. And I learned so much from that. And also read stories written by marginalized people, and that can show what affects them and their communities. So I think as editors, we should always be curious and absorb the conversations that are happening around language change.
Great advice.
That's great advice, Crystal. And
we'll put a link to the Conscious Style Guide in the show notes as well.
Definitely. And there's just one thing I want to pick up on that I said right at the beginning of this episode, where I said about editors being in groups where there are diverse editing groups, where there are perhaps other editors of color and from different ethnicities. And I want to just add that the burden should not be on those editors to explain things to us. That we don't expect them to put in the emotional labor, but we can learn when they talk. And I think that's really important. I've seen activists talking about this expectation that we may put on them to constantly be explaining themselves or explaining decisions. And I think the onus is on us as editors to do our own research and seek out the information rather than just sit back and expect others to pour it in our ears all the time. So I just wanted to clarify my statement at the beginning there, that I don't expect to just turn up in these places and have it all handed to me on a plate.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And two, if you do ask for knowledge and expertise, compensate, just like we ask and hope and expect to be compensated for our time as editors. If we're asking someone else for their advice or knowledge or lived experience, we should be compensating them for that too.
Yeah, definitely.
So another resource is Ruth King's Mindful of Race, which is brilliant for helping people understand the language of race and think about race and think about something Crystal said, think about their own identities and how those, just being conscious of maybe the privilege you have and working out how to talk to people about issues of race at least.
Great. We'll pop a link to that in the show notes as well then, shall we? Crystal, I think we could probably, as you've alluded to more than once in this conversation, we could probably talk for a year on the podcast about this topic, because there is so much to talk about and to dive into that impacts editing and our relationship with writers and the audience that they're writing for. So I just want to say, I'm sure we'll have you back again at some point if you're willing to come and talk to us, because it's always so enlightening. Just thank you so much. It has been another brilliant, enlightening episode for us and our readers. You just never fail to deliver really useful stuff.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. So that's it for this week. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can rate, review and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you prefer.
Yes, thanks so much for listening. Now, if you'd like to help support the Editing Podcast, you can join our Patreon community for as little as £3 a month and get exclusive access to live question and answer sessions for just a few pounds more.
We'd absolutely love to have you on board. If you're interested, just hop over to patreon.com/editing podcast. We'll include a link to that in the show notes too. So she's been Denise.
And she's been Louise. And Crystal's been Crystal. Join us again soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.